I never thought a pellet stove would be the thing that finally pushed me over the edge. But here I was at 2 in the morning, staring at a cease and desist letter from the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, while my living room temperature dropped to 58 degrees. My name is Gregory Moran, and I had just moved into this development outside Portland, Oregon 6 months ago. The house was perfect, a 3-bedroom ranch with a view of Mount Hood on clear days, and the price was right. Sure, the HOA fees were a bit steep at $300 a month, but the neighborhood looked immaculate, and I figured it was worth it for the maintained common areas and the sense of community. What I did not know was that the HOA president, a woman named Patricia Henderson, had the temperament of a caffeinated wolverine and the social skills of a DMV employee on their worst day. The pellet stove had been a necessity, not a luxury. The house's ancient oil furnace died 3 weeks into November, right when the first cold snap hit. The replacement quote came in at $18,000, and my savings account laughed at me. A friend suggested a pellet stove as a temporary solution, maybe permanent if it worked well enough. I did my research, bought a top-rated model for $3,000, and had it professionally installed in my living room. The thing was efficient, eco-friendly, and kept my house warm for a fraction of what electric heat would cost. Everything was fine for exactly 2 weeks. Then Patricia showed up at my door on a Sunday morning, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my stove, and carrying a leather-bound copy of the HOA bylaws like it was a religious text. "Mr. Moran, we need to discuss your recent home modification," she said, not waiting for an invitation before stepping into my entryway. She was in her mid-50s, with that severe haircut that seemed mandatory for women in positions of minor authority, the kind where the back is shorter than the front and every strand is lacquered into place. "The pellet stove?" I asked, genuinely confused. I had checked the bylaws before installation. There was nothing prohibiting heating alternatives, and the unit was properly vented and inspected. "What about it? The noise," she said, as if I had installed a diesel generator in my garage. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Chen, has complained about the disruptive sounds coming from your property." I blinked. "What noise? The stove barely makes any sound at all." Patricia pulled out her phone and played a video. In it, you could hear a sound like plastic pellets cascading into a metal container, which lasted maybe 15 seconds. It was the sound of me refilling the hopper, something I did once a day, usually around 7 in the evening. "This is classified as a nuisance under Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our community guidelines," she said, tapping the bylaws. "No resident shall create, maintain, or permit any noise that unreasonably disturbs the peace and quiet of neighboring properties." "That's the sound of pellets going into the hopper," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "It takes less than 20 seconds once per day. Mrs. Chen's dog barks more than that." "Mrs. Chen's dog is a living creature. Your stove is an appliance and an unapproved one at that." "Unapproved?" I checked the rules. There's nothing about pellet stoves. "Exactly," Patricia said, as if she had just won a debate championship. "There is nothing specifically approving them either. Any significant modification to a home's heating system requires board approval." "You failed to submit the proper paperwork." This was news to me, and I told her as much. She handed me a form 3 pages long, requiring detailed specifications, contractor information, and a non-refundable $200 processing fee. The kicker was at the bottom. Processing time was 6 to 8 weeks. "You're telling me I need to stop using my only heat source in the middle of winter while you take 2 months to approve it. Or you could remove it and restore the property to its original condition," Patricia said pleasantly. The choice is yours. But until this matter is resolved, you are in violation of community standards. Continued use will result in fines of $100 per day. She left before I could formulate a response that did not involve profanity. I stood there in my entryway, holding the form, watching her walk back to her house 3 doors down. Of course, she lived that close. The universe had a sense of humor. I called my real estate agent, a guy named Tom who had sold me the place. He sighed when I explained the situation. "Yeah, Patricia is notorious," he said. "She's been HOA president for 7 years. People are afraid to run against her because she's got dirt on half the neighborhood and makes life hell for anyone who crosses her." "Can she actually fine me for this?" "Technically, maybe. It depends on how the bylaws are interpreted. But fighting it would mean going through the HOA board, and she controls the board. 3 of the 5 members are her friends. Your best bet is to play along, submit the paperwork, and hope she gets bored." Playing along felt like surrender, but I filled out the forms that night, attached all the required documentation, wrote the check for $200, and hand-delivered it to Patricia's mailbox the next morning. I kept using the stove because the alternative was freezing, and I documented everything. The times I refilled the hopper, the duration of the noise, the ambient temperature in my house. The fines started arriving 3 days later. $100 per day, sent via certified mail. After a week, I had $700 in penalties, and the HOA had not even acknowledged receipt of my application. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, which was held on the 3rd Tuesday of every month in the community center. About 30 people showed up, most of them older residents who had lived in Meadowbrook Heights for years. I sat in the back and waited for my chance to speak during the open comment period. Patricia ran the meeting like a general addressing troops. She sat at the head table with the 4 other board members. Craig Thompson, a retired accountant; Denise Wu, who owned a local bakery; Robert Fletcher, a lawyer who specialized in estate planning; and Margaret Sullivan, who I later learned was Patricia's former college roommate. The meeting covered budget reports, landscaping bids, and a lengthy discussion about whether to replace the pool furniture. When open comments finally came, I stood up and introduced myself. "I'd like to discuss the issue with my pellet stove," I said. "I've submitted all the required paperwork, but I'm being fined daily for using my only heat source. I think that's unreasonable, especially since the noise complaint is about 15 seconds of sound once per day." Patricia did not even look at me. "Your application is being reviewed. Until it's approved, you remain in violation." Next comment. "Wait, how long does review take? And what's the criteria for approval?" "That's not a comment, Mr. Moran, that's a question. This is the comment period. If you have questions about your application, you can submit them in writing." Next, I felt the blood rush to my face. "This is ridiculous. You're fining me for keeping my house warm." "Order," Patricia said, rapping her knuckles on the table. "Personal attacks will not be tolerated. If you continue disrupting this meeting, you'll be asked to leave." An older man in the front row stood up. "Pat, come on. The man's got a point. It's cold out, and if he checked the rules before installing it, maybe we should cut him some slack." "Thank you for your input, Howard, but the board has procedures for a reason. We can't make exceptions just because someone finds them inconvenient." I left the meeting angrier than when I arrived. Over the next week, I did some digging into the HOA's history. What I found was enlightening and disturbing. Patricia had been involved in disputes with at least a dozen homeowners over the years. One family was fined thousands of dollars for painting their house the wrong shade of beige, even though they had used a color from the approved palette. Another resident was cited for parking his work truck in his own driveway, despite having a valid commercial vehicle permit from the county. In every case, Patricia pushed until people either complied, sold their homes, or ended up in legal battles that drained their savings. I also learned about something called the Oregon Planned Community Act, which governed HOAs in the state. According to the law, HOA boards had to act reasonably and in good faith. Fines could not be punitive or excessive, and homeowners had the right to a fair hearing before penalties were imposed. The more I read, the more I realized Patricia was walking a legal tightrope. I contacted Robert Fletcher directly, the lawyer on the board, and requested a meeting. He agreed to see me at his office in downtown Portland, a sleek space with windows overlooking the Willamette River. "I'll be straight with you," Robert said after I explained my situation. "Patricia runs that board, and she doesn't take kindly to being challenged. Personally, I think your pellet stove is a non-issue, but I'm 1 vote out of 5. Can she legally fine me like this?" "Probably not if you challenged it. The fines are supposed to be progressive and reasonable. Starting at $100 per day with no warning or hearing is aggressive, but taking her to court would cost you more than just paying the fines, at least in the short term." "What if other people got involved? You said there have been other disputes. What if we organized?" Robert leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "That's an interesting thought. Patricia's made a lot of enemies. If enough people pushed back at once, she'd have a harder time maintaining control. But you'd need to be careful. She's vindictive." I left his office with a plan forming. I spent the next 2 weeks knocking on doors, talking to neighbors, and documenting their complaints about the HOA. What I found was a community held hostage by petty tyranny. There was a couple on Maple Drive who were fined for installing solar panels, even though Oregon law explicitly protected homeowners' right to use solar energy. A single mom on Oak Street was being harassed about her lawn, which had a few brown patches from her kids playing in the yard. An elderly veteran named Frank Morrison had been threatened with foreclosure over unpaid fines related to his flagpole being 3 inches taller than the approved height. By the time the next board meeting rolled around, I had 15 people willing to speak up. We coordinated our approach. Each person would share their story during the comment period, creating a pattern of abuse that even Patricia could not dismiss. The community center was packed that Tuesday night. Patricia noticed the crowd immediately, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the room. "We have a full agenda tonight," she began, "so we'll need to keep comments brief." "Actually," I said, standing up before she could move on, "we have a lot to discuss, and I think you'll find the room disagrees with your priorities." One by one, my neighbors stood and shared their experiences. Frank talked about his 30 years of military service and how he was facing the loss of his home over a flagpole. The couple with solar panels presented their paperwork showing the installation was legal under state law. The single mom broke down in tears, describing how Patricia had shown up at her door with a tape measure to verify the length of her grass. Patricia tried to maintain control, rapping on the table and calling for order, but the room had turned. Even Craig and Denise, the board members who usually backed Patricia reflexively, looked uncomfortable. When the stories finished, I stood again. "I've been documenting all of this, and I've consulted with an attorney. What's happening here isn't just unfair, it's illegal. The Oregon Planned Community Act requires HOAs to act reasonably and in good faith. These fines and threats are neither. So here's what's going to happen. We're calling for a vote of no confidence in the current board president. If that fails, we're prepared to file a class action lawsuit against the HOA for harassment and violations of state law." The room erupted in applause. Patricia's face went red, then white. She stood abruptly, gathering her papers. "This meeting is adjourned," she said. "You can't adjourn the meeting," Robert said, speaking for the first time. "There's a motion on the floor. We need to vote." "I don't recognize the motion." "It doesn't matter if you recognize it. The bylaws are clear. Any resident can call for a vote on board leadership, and it requires a majority of homeowners present to pass. We have a quorum." Robert looked around the room. "All in favor of removing Patricia Henderson as HOA president, say aye." The ayes were overwhelming. Patricia stood frozen at the head table, her knuckles white against the surface. "The motion passes," Robert said quietly. "Patricia, you're relieved. We'll elect an interim president at the next meeting." Patricia left without another word, practically running out of the community center. The room buzzed with energy and relief, people hugging and shaking hands like they had just been liberated from occupation. Robert approached me afterward. "That took guts," he said, "but you know she's not going to take this lying down." He was right. The next morning, I woke to find my front yard vandalized. Someone had spray-painted "Troublemaker" across my garage door in red letters 3 feet high. My mailbox was bent in half, and pellets from my stove were scattered across the driveway. I called the police. 2 officers showed up within an hour, took photos, and filed a report. One of them, a younger guy named Officer Ramirez, shook his head as he surveyed the damage. "We've had calls from this neighborhood before," he said. "Usually property disputes, HOA stuff." "You really think the former president did this?" "I don't know for sure, but the timing is suspicious. We'll do what we can, but without evidence or witnesses, it's hard to pursue. You might want to install a security camera." I took his advice, ordering a system that day and having it installed by the weekend. The cameras covered my front yard, driveway, and entryway. I also got one for the back, just in case. For a few days, things were quiet. The HOA, now under temporary leadership of Craig Thompson, sent a letter rescinding all my fines and approving the pellet stove retroactively. I received apology letters from the board, and Craig even came by in person to make amends. "We should have stepped in sooner," he said, looking genuinely remorseful. "Patricia had us all intimidated. She knew things about people, personal things, and she used them as leverage. I'm not proud of how I acted." "What kind of things?" Craig hesitated. "Stuff from people's pasts." "Affairs, financial troubles, legal issues. She was on the board when most of us bought our houses, had access to background checks and applications. She used it to keep people in line." "That's blackmail." "Yeah, well, hard to prove, but she's done now, so maybe we can move forward." I wanted to believe him, but that night, my security cameras caught something interesting. At 2:30 in the morning, a figure in dark clothing approached my house from the side yard. They carried something, I could not tell what, and moved toward my garage. The motion sensor light flicked on, and the figure ran, but not before the camera got a clear shot of their face. It was Patricia. I downloaded the footage immediately and called the police. Officer Ramirez came back out, this time with a senior detective named Linda Kowalski. They reviewed the footage on my laptop. "That's definitely her," Detective Kowalski said, "and it looks like she's carrying a container of some kind. Could be paint, gasoline, who knows. Combined with the previous vandalism, we've got enough for a warrant." "A warrant?" "To search her property, get her phone records, that sort of thing. If she's been harassing you, there might be evidence. Plus, attempted vandalism and trespassing are crimes. We take this seriously." They left with copies of the footage, and I spent the rest of the night barely sleeping, jumping at every sound outside. The next day was a blur of phone calls and text messages from neighbors. Apparently, word had spread about Patricia being caught on camera, and people were coming forward with their own stories. One woman, Zara Valdez, reached out to me directly. She lived on the far side of the development, a place I had not canvassed during my organizing efforts. She was in her early 40s, worked as a freelance graphic designer, and had been fighting with Patricia for over a year about her home-based business. She tried to fine me for having clients visit my house, Zara explained over coffee at a local cafe. Said it violated the residential-only clause in the bylaws, even though I don't run a storefront or have employees. It's just me, working from my spare bedroom and occasionally meeting a client in person. She was relentless. I spent $5,000 on a lawyer to fight it. Did you win? Eventually, yeah. But she made my life hell during the process. She'd drive by my house multiple times a day, take pictures, document every car that parked on the street. I had to get a restraining order. You got a restraining order against her. Temporary one, yeah. It expired after 6 months, and she stayed away long enough for it to lapse. But now, with everything happening, I want to make sure she's held accountable. Can I give my information to the detective? I connected Zara with Detective Kowalski, and over the next week, a picture emerged of Patricia's behavior that went way beyond petty HOA disputes. The police found evidence on her phone of her stalking multiple residents, including time-stamped photos taken at odd hours and detailed logs of people's comings and goings. They also found drafts of threatening letters that were never sent, and communications with a lawyer about potential lawsuits against residents who opposed her. The breaking point came when they searched her home and found a file cabinet full of dossiers on nearly every resident in Meadowbrook Heights. These were not just basic information packets. They were invasive compilations of personal data, credit reports, social media activity, employment histories, medical information obtained through questionable means, and even private investigator reports on several people. Detective Kowalski called me to her office downtown. We're charging her with stalking, harassment, criminal trespass, and attempted vandalism, she said. The dossiers are a bigger problem. Some of that information was obtained illegally. We're talking identity theft, violation of privacy laws, possibly fraud. This goes way beyond HOA drama. This is criminal. Will I need to testify? Probably, yes. You and several other residents. The DA is building a case and they're taking it seriously. People like Patricia think they are untouchable because they're in positions of power, even small ones. But the law applies to everyone. Patricia was arrested on a Thursday morning. I was not there, but several neighbors were, and they described the scene. 2 squad cars pulling up to her house, officers walking her out in handcuffs while she shouted about persecution and false accusations. Her lawyer showed up within the hour, and she was released on bail that afternoon, but the damage was done. The local news picked up the story, running a segment about the HOA president turned stalker. Our neighborhood became briefly infamous. The HOA held an emergency meeting to address the situation. Craig, still acting as interim president, opened the floor for discussion about how to move forward. The consensus was clear. Implement stronger oversight, limit the president's authority, and create a transparent process for disputes. Robert, the lawyer, volunteered to rewrite the bylaws to reflect these changes. We also need to address the legal liability, Robert said. Patricia's actions were her own, but she committed some of them under the color of HOA authority. We could face lawsuits from affected residents. What's our exposure? Someone asked. Hard to say. Could be substantial. We have insurance, but it might not cover criminal activity. My advice is to settle with anyone who has legitimate grievances, make them whole financially, and move on. I was offered a settlement of $10,000 to cover my fines, legal consultations, and the cost of repairing the vandalism. Others received similar offers, adjusted based on their situations. Zara got $15,000 due to her extended legal battle. Frank, the veteran with the flagpole, received $20,000 and a formal apology, along with permission to keep his flagpole at whatever height he deemed appropriate. Patricia's criminal trial took months to unfold. I testified in June, describing the fines, the confrontations, and the vandalism. Zara testified about the stalking and harassment. Frank brought several other veterans to sit in the gallery as a show of support. The prosecution presented the dossiers, the phone records, the security footage, and testimony from a forensic computer analyst who traced some of the illegally obtained information back to Patricia's accounts. Her defense attorney tried to paint her as a dedicated community leader who took her responsibilities too seriously, someone who crossed lines but did not have criminal intent. The jury did not buy it. After 3 days of deliberation, they found her guilty on multiple counts: stalking, harassment, criminal trespass, identity theft, and fraud. The identity theft and fraud charges were the most serious, both felonies carrying potential prison time. Sentencing happened in August. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Carolyn Foster, did not mince words. "Miss Henderson, you abused a position of trust within your community," she said from the bench. "You used personal information to manipulate, intimidate, and control your neighbors. You stalked them, harassed them, and when that wasn't enough, you vandalized their property. This court takes these offenses seriously. You're sentenced to 3 years in state prison on the felony counts, to run concurrently, with an additional 2 years of supervised probation upon release. You're also ordered to pay restitution to all affected parties and to have no contact with any residents of Meadowbrook Heights." Patricia showed no emotion as the sentence was read. She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs for the second time, and that was the last I saw of her. Life in Meadowbrook Heights slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. The HOA elected new leadership, a retired teacher named Helen Brandt who ran on a platform of common sense and community building. The revised bylaws passed with overwhelming support, limiting fines, requiring hearings before penalties were imposed, and creating an appeal process for residents who disagreed with board decisions. My pellet stove continued to work perfectly, keeping my house warm through the following winter without complaint. I eventually replaced the oil furnace, but I kept the stove as a backup, and because I genuinely liked it. The sound of pellets cascading into the hopper became a comforting reminder that I had stood up for myself and my community. Zara and I became friends through the whole ordeal, bonding over shared trauma and the absurdity of HOA politics. She designed a new logo for the neighborhood newsletter, a friendly cartoon house with a welcoming door, a stark contrast to the authoritarian vibe Patricia had cultivated. Frank invited me to a Memorial Day barbecue at his house, where his flagpole flew the American flag at its full, unapproved height. We stood in his backyard, drinking beer and watching the sun set over the development, and he raised his bottle in a toast. "To standing up to tyrants, no matter how small their kingdoms," he said. "I'll drink to that," I replied. The following months were peaceful. The HOA focused on actual community issues, organizing block parties, improving the playground equipment, and negotiating a better contract for snow removal. Meetings were productive instead of contentious, and people actually wanted to attend. I ran into Craig one day at the grocery store, and he pulled me aside in the produce section. "I wanted to thank you again," he said. for having the guts to stand up when the rest of us wouldn't. I've been on that board for 5 years, and I never felt good about the way things were run. I should have said something sooner. You said something when it mattered, I told him. That vote wouldn't have happened without you. Still, you started it. You organized people. That takes leadership. I just wanted to stay warm, I said with a laugh. But it was more than that, and we both knew it. It was about dignity, about not letting petty tyrants control your life, about community in the real sense of the word. Patricia had ruled through fear and manipulation, but in the end, people were stronger than that. The legal aftermath continued for a while. Several residents who had not been part of the initial settlement came forward with their own claims, and the HOA's insurance company eventually paid out over $200,000 in total. The HOA had to raise fees temporarily to cover the deductible and legal costs, but even that was handled transparently, with Helen explaining the situation at a town hall and taking questions until everyone understood. I attended Patricia's probation hearing 2 years later, more out of curiosity than anything else. She had served her time and was being released early for good behavior. The hearing was brief, mostly procedural, but at the end, the judge asked if any victims wanted to make a statement. I stood up. Patricia looked at me, her face harder than I remembered, etched with lines that had not been there before. I don't have much to say, I began. I think you know what you did was wrong. I hope you've had time to reflect on that. I also hope you understand that communities function on trust and respect, not fear. I don't wish you ill, Miss Henderson. I just hope you learned something. She did not respond, just looked away. The judge concluded the hearing, laying out the terms of her probation. No contact with any former Meadowbrook Heights residents, regular check-ins with a probation officer, community service, and mandatory counseling. She left the courtroom quickly, and I never saw her again. Back in the neighborhood, life went on. I got a promotion at work, started dating a woman I met at a community yoga class held in the park, and even volunteered to serve on a subcommittee about sustainable landscaping. The pellet stove saga became a story I told at parties, usually to laughs and disbelief. You're telling me you almost went to war over a heating appliance? My girlfriend, Emma, said the first time I told her. Not just any heating appliance, I corrected. A pellet stove. There's a difference. She rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. One evening in late October, almost 2 years after everything began, I was sitting in my living room, the pellet stove humming quietly in the corner. The hopper needed refilling, so I grabbed the bag of pellets from the garage and poured them in, the familiar cascading sound echoing briefly through the house. I smiled, remembering Patricia's outrage over those 15 seconds of noise. My doorbell rang. I opened it to find Helen, the current HOA president, holding a plate of cookies. Thought you might like these, she said. I was baking and made too many. Thanks, Helen. Want to come in? She stepped inside, glancing at the pellet stove. That's the infamous stove, huh? The one and only. It's funny how something so small became such a big deal. It was never about the stove, I said. It was about control. Well, I'm glad those days are behind us. The neighborhood feels different now. Better. We chatted for a few minutes, talking about upcoming Halloween decorations and the possibility of organizing a food drive for Thanksgiving. After she left, I sat back down, the warmth from the stove spreading through the room. I thought about how close I had come to just giving in, removing the stove and accepting the fines. It would have been easier in the short term, but it would have also meant letting Patricia continue her reign unchecked. Sometimes standing up for yourself was not about the specific issue, but about drawing a line and refusing to let it be crossed. The holidays came and went. By the time spring arrived, Meadowbrook Heights had fully transformed. Gardens bloomed without fear of violating some obscure regulation. Kids played in yards without parents worrying about grass length. People painted their doors cheerful colors, installed bird feeders, and generally made the neighborhood feel like a place where humans actually lived instead of a sterile showroom. I bumped into Robert, the lawyer, at a community cleanup day where we were planting trees along the main road. "You ever think about running for the board?" he asked, digging a hole for a sapling. "God, no," I said immediately. "I've had enough HOA drama to last a lifetime." "Fair enough. But you'd be good at it. You care about this place and people trust you. Maybe someday. Right now, I'm happy just living here without constantly looking over my shoulder," he laughed. "That's the dream, isn't it?" That summer, the neighborhood held its first annual block party, a full-day event with food trucks, live music, and games for kids. Someone set up a dunk tank, and people paid $5 for 3 throws to dunk various board members. It was all in good fun, a far cry from the tense, formal atmosphere Patricia had cultivated. I manned the grill for a few hours, flipping burgers and hot dogs while chatting with neighbors I barely knew before. The sense of community was real now, not enforced through regulations but built organically through shared experiences and mutual respect. As the sun set and the band started playing classic rock covers, Emma and I danced on the makeshift dance floor someone had set up in the street. Looking around at the laughing faces, the kids running around with glow sticks, the older folks sitting in lawn chairs and tapping their feet to the music, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what a neighborhood should be. Not a collection of houses governed by arbitrary rules, but a community of people looking out for each other, celebrating together, and yes, sometimes disagreeing, but doing so with respect and good faith. The pellet stove sat in my living room, quiet and unassuming, just another appliance doing its job. But every time I refilled the hopper, every time I heard that brief cascade of pellets, I remembered what it represented: the importance of standing up for yourself, the power of community organizing, and the fundamental truth that bullies, no matter how small their domain, can only rule through the consent of the governed. And we had withdrawn that consent. Years passed, and the story became neighborhood lore. New residents moving in would hear about the great HOA revolt, usually told with some embellishment and laughter. Patricia's name became shorthand for what the community rejected, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and petty tyranny. I eventually did join the board, serving a 2-year term as treasurer. It was boring work, mostly managing budgets and vendor contracts, but it felt important. Every decision we made, we asked ourselves, are we serving the community or controlling it? That simple question kept us honest. The pellet stove finally died 5 years after installation, a good run for any appliance. I replaced it with a newer model, more efficient and even quieter. I did not bother submitting paperwork to the HOA. Under the revised bylaws, heating system upgrades were specifically listed as approved modifications requiring only a courtesy notification. I sent Helen an email with the installation details. She replied within an hour. "Thanks for letting us know. Enjoy the warmth." That was it. No drama, no fines, no accusations. Just a simple acknowledgement between neighbors. It felt revolutionary after everything we had been through. Emma and I got married in the community center, the same room where the board meetings had taken place. The symbolism was not lost on anyone, and during the reception, Frank gave a toast that brought down the house. "Gregory could have just paid the fines and moved on," he said, his voice strong despite his 80-plus years. "But he stood up. He organized. He reminded us that we don't have to accept being pushed around, not in our own homes. So here's to Gregory and Emma and to standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The room erupted in applause. Emma squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes. "You really made an impression here," she whispered. "We all did," I said. "Together." And that was the truth of it. I had started the ball rolling, but it took a community to finish the job. Everyone who spoke up at that meeting, everyone who shared their story, everyone who voted for change, they were all part of it. As the night wound down and we said our goodbyes, I stood outside the community center with Emma, looking at the houses scattered across the development, warm lights glowing in windows, people visible through curtains going about their lives in peace. "Think you'll ever leave this place?" Emma asked. "Not if I can help it," I said. "We fought for this, made it better. That means something." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "It does." We walked home through streets I knew by heart now, past houses belonging to people who were more than just neighbors. They were comrades, friends, fellow citizens of a tiny republic we had reclaimed from tyranny. The new pellet stove was waiting when we got home, ready to keep us warm through another winter. I thought about filling the hopper but decided it could wait until morning. Instead, Emma and I sat on the couch, her feet in my lap, talking about our honeymoon plans and the garden we wanted to plant in the spring. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and carrying the scent of wood smoke from someone else's fireplace. The neighborhood settled into comfortable quiet, the kind that comes not from fear but from contentment. Somewhere out there, Patricia Henderson was living whatever life she had built after prison and probation. I did not waste energy thinking about her, did not harbor resentment or anger. She had done what she did, faced consequences, and that chapter was closed. What mattered was what came after. The community we built, the bonds we forged, the simple freedom to heat our homes without persecution. These were not small things. They were everything. I kissed Emma's forehead, feeling grateful for this house, this neighborhood, these people who had become family. The pellet stove would keep us warm just like always. But the real warmth came from knowing we lived in a place where people looked out for each other, where common sense prevailed over petty rules, where neighbors were neighbors in the truest sense. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I heard the wind rattling the windows and the house settling into its foundation. Comfortable sounds, home sounds. I thought about all the people in Meadowbrook Heights, sleeping peacefully in their beds, no longer afraid of a knock on the door or a fine in the mail. We had won. Not just against Patricia, but against the idea that authority could not be questioned, that rules mattered more than people, that communities were something to be managed rather than lived in. The pellet stove had been the spark, but we had built the fire together, and it was still burning bright.